All right, so let's talk about the human body. All right, so anatomy and physiology are two really closely related scientific disciplines. They generally go hand in hand. So in this course, we're going to examine both the anatomy and the physiology of the human body together rather than studying them separately. All right, so some courses you might take may separate them, but we're generally going to look at the two together. All right. So anatomy is the study of the structure and identity of the various body parts. So there are many different ways for us to study anatomy. There's many subdisciplines that have evolved. Gross anatomy is what focuses on the body as a whole. So that's where we're going to be spending most of our time and attention, is on the gross anatomy of the human body. There's also like another branch, right, of microanatomy, which would be looking at tissue and cellular structures. So microanatomy, you need a microscope, basically. So we're not going to deal too much with the microanatomy. We will talk a little bit about some cell physiology stuff, but we're not going to spend a whole lot of time on cells. So like I said, anatomy is that study of the parts of the body, then physiology is the study of how those parts work together. So we can think of anatomy and physiology simply as asking kind of two separate but distinct questions. Anatomy asks us, what is the structure? What is its form? What does it look like? And then physiology asks, how does it work, or how does it function? So understanding the form of a structure will help us to understand its function. So by if we understand the way something's designed, or the way it looks, then we can make predictions about how it's going to function, right? So, for example, the shapes of our bones, right? If it's got a big kind of rounded end on it, that's probably going to be a joint that's able to do rotational movement, versus joints that are shaped more like a hinge are only going to be able to extend and flex. Another general kind of feature would be that so like parts that are connected to each other, right, probably are going to work together. So that's another kind of underlying principle here, is that, like I said, understanding the form is going to better help us understand how it functions, right? So if I have different blood vessels that are connected to my heart, I can make predictions about what those vessels are supposed to do, or where the blood is going to move to. All right, so let's try a first review question. Physiology is the study of the form or structure of the parts of the body. True or false? I don't know how some of the responses keep going away. Like it'll jump up and then jump back down. I need to disable that. All right. Looks like most everybody got it. All right. So remember, anatomy is the study of the form or structure of the parts of the body. Physiology is more about how they function. All right, so all medicine is based on our fundamental understanding of anatomy. So we can kind of think of anatomy as our user's manual for the whole human body. When a mechanic works on a car, they're going to refer to that user's manual to know what parts are connected to each other, how things are worked, where we need to make repairs, adjustments to fix the problem. So as an EMT, we're going to use A&P to understand where vital structures are located, how they function, and how injury and illness affect our bodies. So you can't really understand how to treat a patient or why the treatment works if you don't understand how the affected body system functions normally. So, right, if I'm gonna think about how a system is not functioning correctly, I would first need to understand how that system is supposed to function under normal conditions. Yes.
Yeah, just a general question. What's the difference between how the body works, the function and the work?
So function and work would be pretty much the same thing. Yeah. So anatomy, like I said, is really just like naming the parts, right? And identifying the parts, and physiology is concerned with how all of those parts actually work together. Does that make sense?
Yeah, I just saw a separate questions.
Oh, got it. Yeah. So anatomy also helps us communicate, as we covered last time, right? We have medical terminology that we use, and anatomy is included in that. So we gave the example last time, right, of a bellyache versus we can be much more specific with our terminology that would better describe the patient's condition more accurately. So we use this language to communicate with other medical professionals. When we're working with doctors and nurses, especially, right, you want to be able to communicate clearly. You don't want the doctor to think you're an idiot when we're handing off this patient. And part of the way that we're going to do that, right, is by using the proper terminology. So we're not going to come into the hospital and again, tell the doctor that the patient has a bellyache. I'm going to give a more thorough assessment of what the patient's problem is using precise language that can better describe what the patient's condition is or what their problem is. It's also going to help us better communicate with our patients. So you'll be able to explain things easier to them or help explain them in a way that they can understand. But if you don't understand it yourself, you're not going to be able to give that explanation to the patients. Your patient's confidence in you is also going to be built on your ability to be able to tell them what you're doing and why you're doing it, right? So we need to establish that trust with our patients, and having a better understanding of this stuff is going to help you to do that. Then finally, kind of as we saw last time too, with our lecture on medical terminology, if we know the name of some of these structures or have an idea on some of the roots, we can better identify or name other ones. So a lot of our anatomical structures will be named similarly that are like found in the same region of the body. So for example, the lateral bone in your arm or in your forearm is your radius. Right, and then right over top of the radius, we have the radial pulse that we are able to feel out here, right, which is named because it runs over top of the radius, okay? This area of the arm is generally referred to as brachial. So you have the brachial pulse that runs right through here that we can feel. We also have a large bundle of nerves that runs in this area called the brachial plexus. So like I said, just a lot of these structures are going to be named similarly based on the area of the body that they're in. All right, so this is a just excerpt from an article posted by the Journal of Emergency Medical Services that talks about why anatomy is important. So it says, providers should be taught the benefit of certain assessments. EMS educators need to dive deep with their providers and discuss anatomy, physiology, and pathophysiology to help them better understand the reasons why they perform certain assessments and render certain treatments. The concept is not just to do something because it is required to be done according to protocol. We must strive to understand when medications should or should not be given and what valuable information can be gained from certain assessments. So the idea is that we want you guys to be able to critically think when it comes to your patients, right? I don't want you to be what we call cookie cutter EMTs who only know how to treat things that are in their protocol book. You need to have the tools to be able to think outside of the box for when you're presented with a patient who doesn't perfectly fall into one of those protocols, right? What do we do with a patient who's got chest pain and difficulty breathing? Which protocol do I follow? Do I follow chest pain or do I follow difficulty breathing? Right? We need to have a thorough understanding of the entire system and how it's working together so that I know how to best treat my patient. Okay, so there are two ways that we can locate structures of the body, and surface anatomy is going to be our kind of first indicator to things. So surface anatomy is just stuff that I can see just with my eyes, just looking at the body. Topographic anatomy are superficial landmarks that serve as guides to structures that lie beneath them, such as notches, joints, bumps, etc. So for example, right, the rib cage could be a topographic or surface anatomy guide to where the heart and the lungs are, right? I know that those sit behind the rib cage, so if I can find the ribs, I know I'm in the general area of the lungs and the heart. So some common landmarks, surface anatomy stuff that we would want to know. So the ribs, like we just talked about, and then the sternum, which makes up the middle portion, right? All the ribs connect to the sternum right in the middle. So the heart and lungs, like we talked about, are underneath. Another one would be the thyroid cartilage that can be seen on the front of the neck, all right, commonly called the Adam's apple. Our trachea, which is our breathing pipe, our breathing tube essentially, sits right behind that Adam's apple there. So that's another guide for where that's at. That trachea is going to be a really important thing as we talk about airway, as we talk about trauma. We're going to specifically learn how to assess the patient's trachea and its position. So knowing how to find it very quickly on the outside of the body is going to be very important for us as EMTs. The xiphoid process would be another one. So that's at the bottom of the sternum. You can feel it right down here on the front of your chest. And it's a landmark that we're going to use as a guide right when doing CPR. So we feel for where that xiphoid process is, and we go just above it with the palm of our hand. So we're going to learn in this class how to do physical examination of a patient, right? And that's all based on our knowledge of anatomy and especially surface anatomy, right? So this is how we actually apply that surface anatomy is when we go to do a physical exam of the patient. So whether they're medical patients, whether they're trauma patients, at some point we're going to physically look at their body for signs of injury or signs of illness. So we can learn a lot by observing that external form and surface of the body, or by observing and feeling structures beneath its surface. So for example, we could palpate an artery, right? Which is something we've already learned how to do, right? Feel for a patient's pulse. Palpation is going to be an important point of most of our assessments. That word palpation means that we're touching the patient or touching a certain structure, okay? So we're actually going to, like I said, feel different structures in the patient's body as a key point in our physical exam. So we gave the example last time of the 4 quadrants of the abdomen, right? So if our patient is complaining of abdominal pain, we're going to palpate each of those quadrants individually to assess, is there something wrong with one of the organs in this quadrant, right? If I find swelling or pain just in a single quadrant, that's probably indicative that there's something going on with the organs that lie within that abdominal quadrant. So by understanding that surface anatomy, we can better visualize those structures that lie beneath, and we can distinguish unusual or abnormal findings. So another thing we're going to do is, like, we're not just going to look, we're not just going to feel, but we're also going to listen. All right. So we've got our handy dandy stethoscope, right? And we're going to use that to listen to structures beneath the surface of the skin as well. All right. So we're going to use the ribs, the sternum as our landmarks and guides on where we're going to listen to lung sounds, where we're going to listen to heart sounds, where we would listen to bowel sounds. All right. So this is a brief review from last time. Hopefully we all remember that anatomic position. Remember that all of kind of our anatomical references are going to be based off of this position. So if we're referring to the anterior of the body, right, it's going to be the body in this position. So pay special attention, right, to the way the hands and the feet are facing, because that's how we describe anterior. Yeah, I think that's good on that. Also remember, patient's left is usually going to be opposite of what we are, right? So if I'm standing looking at the patient, my left is the patient's right, and the patient's right is anatomical right, okay? So we always refer to the body with respect to the patient's own body. So is it their left side or their right side? But generally speaking, if I'm looking, like I said, head on, face first at the patient, it's going to be the opposite of my left and right. All right, major ones to recall from here. Remember that supine is a patient laying on their back, and prone is a patient laying face down. Okay, these will be 2 terms that you will see come up frequently in test questions or scenarios. So make sure that you understand what supine and prone mean. Then the lateral recumbent. So Anybody, what does lateral mean from last time? Okay, yep, so it means the side of the body, right? So now, hopefully this position makes a little bit more sense why we call it the lateral recumbent position, right? Because they're laying on their side. And so we just say which side they're laying on. It's either right or left. All right, so major point to recall from this from last time is remember that that median plane makes the midline right through the middle of the body, okay, which is going to divide the body into left and right halves. We call structures that are close to the midline medial, and we call structures that are far away from the midline lateral. Okay, those will be two other terms that are frequently used when we're discussing anatomy. Remember that the mid-axillary line runs through the armpit and the mid-clavicular line through the middle of the clavicle. Okay, that's why it's named that way. Clavicular, clavicle, middle of the clavicle. All right, so we did that one last time. We did all these. Proximal, remember, means closer to the trunk, closer to the point of the attachment. Distal means further away. The abdominal quadrants, we take that midline that goes right through the middle of the body, right, divides left in half. And then if we draw another line through the middle of the belly button going the other way, that's how we get our 4 abdominal quadrants. All right, bilateral is something on both sides of the body. Unilateral is something that's on one side of the body. And we hit all these terms of movement last time too. All right, so I think most of this room is science majors, if I remember correctly, right? So hopefully this stuff should be a quick review for us. But all living things are highly ordered, and most biological systems have this repeating pattern of taking small structures, we put them together and we get larger structures, okay? So we start with atoms, we put atoms together. Atoms are those smallest unit of matter, and then if we put multiple atoms together, we get a molecule. If I put multiple molecules together, we can get these macromolecules thing. So most biological molecules are polymers, so they're large molecules, right, made of smaller subunits. All right, so the classic example is glucose. We are going to talk a lot about glucose and ATP, cell respiration. Anybody remember that stuff? That's about to come back. But glucose is the classic kind of example of a polymer. So they're, or glucose being the monomer, and we take 2 glucose, put them together and make a polymer. So then if we take a bunch of molecules and start to put them together, we get these things called organelles, which are tiny little organs. All right, so they're multiple macromolecules that interact to form a specific function. Then if you put multiple of those organelles together, you get a cell. All right, so the cell is our smallest actual unit of living thing. So all living things have cells, and the smallest forms of life would be single-celled organisms, like bacteria. So if we put multiple of the same type of cell together to accomplish a single function, we're going to get what's called a tissue. All right, so for example, we have pictured up here muscle tissue on the slide. That's what you're looking at. It's made of muscle cells that have specialized proteins that facilitate movement. So most of your different cell types within a tissue, right, would produce some kind of specific protein that makes it specific to that tissue, right? So muscle cells produce different proteins than a cardiac cell or than a liver cell. So if I take multiple different types of tissue and put them together, then we have an organ. So these are multiple tissue types that work together to accomplish a single function. So for example, your stomach would contain multiple tissue types. It's got muscular tissue that allows the stomach to contract, expand, move, and do some mechanical digestion of the food. And then you also have the specific gastric tissues that would produce acid, that are able to absorb things into the bloodstream. You would have some vascular tissue as well. So most of our organs are going to have some degree of vascular tissue, muscle tissue, and then also whatever the specialized tissue type is in there. Okay, so if we put multiple organs that work together to accomplish a function, then we get an organ system. So for example, our cardiovascular system is the organs of the heart and the blood vessels that work together to bring blood to the entire body. And like I said, almost every body system or every organ itself is going to involve some degree of the functional specialized tissue, plus vascular tissue, plus nervous tissue, plus some kind of smooth muscle tissue as well. All right, so if we put multiple organ systems together, we finally get the organism. And then if we have multiple organisms living within a given area that interact and reproduce with one another, that's when we would call it a population. All right, so why are we talking about this? We need to understand life at its smallest units and how changes in those cellular environments are going to affect the overall organism, right? So drugs are molecules at their base level, right? That is all they are, and they are interacting with specific cell types within our body to produce some kind of effect. So in order to adequately understand how the medications I give the patient are going to affect them, we have to have some understanding of what's happening on that cellular level. So the cellular level is where all of the action's happening, but it's going to produce the downstream effects that we see in the organism. So oxygen is going to be another thing we're going to spend a lot of time talking about in here, right? Which is one of the simplest molecules that exists on Earth. But as we know, it's very vital to life. It's very vital to our physiology of humans. And again, we need to understand what's happening kind of down on that microscopic level in order to understand how it's going to affect my patient. All right, so another important biological concept we have to understand is diffusion. So that's the natural tendency of molecules to want to move from an area of high concentration to low concentration. So just naturally, things want to spread out. They don't want to be crowded together, packed together. So when given the opportunity, molecules are going to spread out. Osmosis refers specifically to the diffusion of water molecules, but water will follow the same natural tendency to move from an area of high concentration to low concentration. So with respect to the human body, we are generally speaking about the concentration of molecules inside or outside of the cell or inside or outside of the bloodstream. When the concentrations of molecules are equal on both sides of whatever membrane we're talking about, we would say that the system is in equilibrium. So this is going to be important for us to understand, right, how drugs get into our body, how oxygen is carried through the bloodstream, how my patient becomes dehydrated, how glucose is moved throughout the body. All of that comes back to these basic kind of principles. So then, of course, we can't talk about diffusion without talking about energy. So diffusion is a passive process that just happens on its own, but sometimes certain molecules are not able to readily diffuse on their own across the cell membrane or into the bloodstream, so we got to help them out somehow. So energy is often used to bring those molecules into the cell. So cells use that form of energy that we call ATP, which stands for adenosine triphosphate. So this is a crucially important molecule to all of our cells that allows them to accomplish many functions. Without ATP, our cells would struggle to perform the vital functions necessary to keep us alive. All right. So our body is a very complex and delicate set of chemical reactions that produce life. The harmonious and balanced interactions of all of these systems is what maintains life. Okay, so everything has to be happening in harmony and in balance for the patient to be healthy and for everything to be going all right. So homeostasis is the tendency of the body to want to maintain those harmonious and balanced environments within our body. So it's going to spend a lot of time and energy trying to maintain the balance of everything in our body. So homeostasis is kind of like our baseline, right? So when we fluctuate away from that baseline for some reason, the body is going to have some kind of mechanism that it engages to bring us back to the baseline. So for example, if my blood oxygen level is too low, my body is going to tell me to start breathing more, right? So we bring in more oxygen. Maybe it'll make you take deeper breaths, more frequent breaths. It might also do things like raise your pulse so that we circulate more blood to get more oxygen out to the tissues, or we might raise the blood pressure. Another example would be if your blood sugar starts to fall too low, your body's going to stimulate you to be hungry so that you go eat something, right? So that we can bring it back to that baseline. So any fluctuations away from that kind of baseline level, wherever we're at, is going to evoke some response in the body. All right. So general question for the class. What is the point of breathing? Why do we have to breathe? Okay. So what do we use the oxygen for? Why do we need oxygen? Okay, good. What does anyone know? What function do we need oxygen for specifically? Anybody? Okay, good. Respiration. And what's the end product of respiration? What do we get out of that? ATP, or energy, right? Okay, so the entire point of us breathing is so that your cells can have energy. All right. So if we want to have energy, we have to be able to breathe. So oxygen and glucose are among the two most important molecules for cells, right? Because that's primarily where we're going to get energy from. So glucose will get eventually converted to ATP. You don't have to know the whole reaction for the point of this class, all right? But oxygen is necessary for that conversion, right? So we call that aerobic metabolism when we use oxygen to produce energy from glucose. In the absence of oxygen, we go through anaerobic metabolism, all right? That anaerobic metabolism is not very efficient. It produces less energy and it produces more waste, all right? The buildup of that waste, called lactate, all right, is going to start to cause the body to become, or cause the blood to become acidic, or what we would call acidotic. All right, so when the patient goes into a state of acidosis, it starts to injure the cells and limits the body's ability to carry oxygen. So then as those acid levels kind of start to build up in our blood, it's going to further impair that oxygen transport and further impair cell function, right? So it's kind of a negative feedback loop, if you will, right? Where it's as we injure the cells, the cells are going to have, excuse me. So as we injure the cells, they're going to have a further impaired ability to use that glucose and oxygen, which is going to downstream make it even more difficult, right? And so it's just kind of like a vicious cycle that keeps going. So we are going to be concerned a lot with in this class, right, of being mindful of when the patient's kind of in this acidotic state and what can we do to correct that. So another way that kind of acidosis can occur in our patient would be the buildup of carbon dioxide within the blood. So this is especially problematic in patients who have been through a cardiac arrest or a respiratory arrest. So if they haven't been breathing on their own, not only have they not been able to get oxygen in, but they've not been able to get rid of their carbon dioxide either. So as those levels start to build up within the body, it's going to convert to carbonic acid and cause the patient's blood to become acidic. And again, producing kind of the same effects here, where it's going to start to injure cells, make it harder to get oxygen, make it harder to get glucose. Yes.
What are the physical signs
Of acidosis? We can physically actually measure their carbon dioxide level, which we will go over another day in class on how we do that, but that would be a good indicator. And then also just kind of general signs and symptoms of shock that we're going to learn would be another indicator that the patient is in this state. Mm-hmm. But anytime where the patient's had like extended downtime, so like we said, like cardiac arrest, respiratory arrest, you should suspect something like this is probable. So one of the body's primary means of decreasing acid is going to be to expel carbon dioxide from the lungs. So a increased respiratory rate would be another kind of sign of this, that the patient is potentially acidotic because the body's just going to try to breathe off the carbon dioxide. All right, so as we kind of been talking about, right, all of these different delicate processes all have to happen together in concert with each other in order to bring about the function that we know as life. So we need to talk about what we call perfusion, which is the movement of oxygen from blood into cells coupled with the removal of their waste. All right, so I have to get oxygen out to all of the cells of the body, but we also have to get their waste away from those cells in order to keep this life support chain thing going. So remember, as we just discussed, that the body wants to maintain homeostasis at all times. So in order to maintain homeostasis, the body must ensure that all the organs and tissues receive adequate perfusion. All right, so this will be another kind of important concept that we're going to continue to come back to in this class is perfusion. All right, so it's two things with perfusion. It's that we're getting enough oxygen and nutrients out to the cells and that we're moving enough waste away from the cells. All right, so adequate perfusion is both of those things. So in order to maintain adequate perfusion, there's a very delicate balance of things that have to happen correctly. So that's what this life support chain refers to, is that all of these delicate processes that happen in concert with one another to maintain perfusion or homeostasis. So let's take a look at a few of the links in our life support chain. So first, so this is just an example, right? This isn't an exhaustive list of everything that's in this life support chain, but these are kind of some of the key ones that we need to understand. So number one, we've got to get enough air into the lungs to reach the smallest, deepest lung structures. All right, and then once I get that air in there, I've got to have enough adequate blood supply to be able to pick up the oxygen and take it elsewhere in my body, right? So if I'm not getting enough air in, or if I'm not getting enough blood to the lungs already, we're going to have a problem with perfusion right there. So then we have to then say within the blood, so let's say we're getting in enough air, we're getting enough blood supply to the lungs. Well, then within the blood itself, there needs to be enough red blood cells that are there with an available hemoglobin to actually receive the oxygen. Okay, so this would be a problem potentially in patients who have certain types of anemia or other blood disorders where they would potentially have a different number of red blood cells, or maybe they have an altered hemoglobin or something. Or in the case of a patient who's been hemorrhaging, right? They've been bleeding out, so they've suffered blood loss, so they're going to have less blood cells available to be able to pick up the oxygen. So then, as we've been talking about, we've got to have a good, stable chemical environment inside the body, right? So if we're too acidic, we're too basic, that diffusion is going to be all thrown off, and the oxygen, the waste is not going to be able to move around correctly. So we've got to have a stable chemical environment in order to sustain life's reactions. In order to make all of this happen, right, our heart needs to be pumping with enough pressure to make sure that we reach all of these tissues and that we circulate enough blood to those tissues. So if at any point, any one thing in this chain breaks, we have lost perfusion. Okay, that's the main idea here, right? So if we just lose one link in the chain, now we have lost perfusion. So we would say that the patient is in a state of hypoperfusion. Okay, so hypoperfusion is another word for shock. So we're going to talk about shock a lot in this course, how to recognize shock, how to treat shock. Okay, but shock would be a life-threatening condition because the patient is in a state of hypoperfusion. All right, so when the patient is in shock, they are not getting enough oxygen or blood nutrients out to their tissues, or they could not be having the waste removed in adequate supply. Either one could cause shock. So we can categorize shock really in two ways. We're going to talk about both. We've got different causes of shock and then different stages of shock. All right, so the two are independent of each other, right? So I could have multiple different things that cause shock, but all patients who go into shock are going to follow the same basic stages, right? So it's going to progress in a logical order through these stages. So then pictured up here on the slide too, we have what's called the perfusion triangle, and it's just kind of hammering home the point that we just went over with the life support chain, right? But if I have a failure in any one of these things, so if my heart fails, my blood vessels fail, or the blood itself has a problem, right, we're not going to have perfusion. So if there's a heart pump function issue, something like a heart attack, right, could cause shock because it's going to impair my heart's ability to pump. If I have a blood clot somewhere that's blocking a blood vessel, again, going to impair the ability to perfuse or to circulate. And then blood, I think the great example here again would be if the patient has bled out. Okay, so not only have we lost blood volume, but we're losing the blood cells themselves. All right, do we have any questions so far? Yes.
Is it the same as stroke or?
It is different than a stroke. Yep. So shock. So a stroke could potentially cause shock, but shock is it's just a general term for that state of hypoperfusion is what shock means. It means that my patient's not getting enough oxygen to their body tissues. All right, so as we've been talking about, anything that disrupts the life support chain can lead to shock. All right, so it doesn't mean 100% that just because we break the chain that the patient's going to go into shock, but the longer that chain is broken and not resolved, the greater the chance that the patient is going to go into shock. So we've got some common different types up here. Anaphylactic is going to be one we'll talk about a lot in this class too. So this is shock that's caused by contact with an allergen. Cardiogenic shock. All right, so we learned last time, right? Cardio means what? Heart. Okay, so gen, G-E-N, does anybody know what that means? Produce, yep. Would you say? Anybody? It means like, produce, start, begin. All right. So cardiogenic shock is shock that's caused by the heart or starts with the heart. All right. So something again like a heart attack or heart failure would be a source of cardiogenic shock. Hypo, what does that prefix mean? Low. Good. All right. So hypovolemic is low volume. So we've got two kind of sub causes of hypovolemic shock. It could be caused by hemorrhage. So we would potentially call that hemorrhagic shock too. So that would be that the patient's just lost a lot of blood. but even dehydration, right? If our patient went days without taking in any fluid, they would have a lower blood volume as well, and that could start to lead to shock. Obstructive shock is something that causes obstruction of the great vessels of the heart, which we are going to talk about what those great vessels are, but essentially the major pipes that are coming into and out of our heart. So if one of those gets blocked, right, that's either going to impair my ability to get blood into the heart or to get blood out of the heart. So that's going to cause a big problem for circulation and perfusion. Neuro, what did we say that prefix means? Brain, good. A brain is also going to refer to like nervous system stuff too. So again, that GEN means something that starts. So neurogenic starts with the brain or the nerves, spinal cord, something like that. So this is shock that's going to be caused by damage to our central nervous system. So if the patient suffers a catastrophic brain injury, right, or head trauma, something like that, that could lead to neurogenic shock. Spinal cord injuries could lead to neurogenic shock. Yes. So it would just be just simply because the patient doesn't have enough volume. So after, you know, dehydration for an extended period of time, there's literally not enough like water left in the blood. And so it's going to make it difficult to maintain circulation because there's not an adequate blood volume anymore. All right, so septic shock is an extreme immune response to an infection. So this is really our best example of some of these types of shock that are caused by not having the waste removed appropriately. So in septic shock, it's usually like a bacteria causes a lot of toxic waste buildup in the cellular environment. And when the body's not able to readily remove it, we get a buildup of lactate, the patient becomes acidotic, and they go into shock, all because of, like I said, an infection. Okay, so again, these are the different causes of shock, or just a kind of a sampling of them. So now we're going to look at some stages of shock. Okay, so this will be something that will 100% be tested on multiple times on the National Registry. So make sure that before we leave tonight, you have a good understanding of this. And if it doesn't make sense when I explain it in just a second, let me know and we'll walk through it again. All right, so the patient is going to start off in what we call compensated shock. All right, so we call it compensated because the body is able to compensate for the lack of perfusion at this point, right? So something in my chain has become disrupted, but we're able to overcome that loss temporarily. So this could be things like raising our heart rate. Maybe we could redistribute blood. So the body does do this sometimes, right? In a state of shock, it will shunt blood from the digestive organs and kind of other ancillary organs to like your brain, lungs, and heart. So if the state of shock continues left untreated, the patient's going to start to develop what we call decompensated shock. All right, so they're losing their ability at this point to be able to compensate for whatever loss has been going on. So we're going to start to see changes in the patient's vital signs at this point. So we're probably up in compensated shock, going to see an elevation in the vital signs, right? So you would see things like the blood pressure increase, the heart rate increase, the breathing rate increase. But when we get to decompensated shock, one of the hallmarks that the patient is in decompensated shock is that their blood pressure starts to drop. All right. So as we're going to learn in this course, we're going to take multiple sets of vital signs on a patient. But if you notice, as we start to take multiple sets that the blood pressure is getting lower, the patient could be moving into this state of decompensated shock. So this is also how we're going to kind of clinically recognize compensated versus decompensated is going to be what's the patient's blood pressure.
So if shock, blood pressure goes down, heart rate,
So the other vital signs will probably start to fall as well, like they'll start to slow down too. But the blood pressure, like I said, is going to be the most characteristic one that the patient is going into decompensated shock. So then finally, we're going to get to irreversible shock if it's still left untreated at that decompensated point. So the mechanisms are completely failing at this point, and the patient has kind of reached a point of no return to where even if we intervene and start doing stuff for the patient, the likelihood of them making it is just very low because their perfusion has been impaired too much. So I think kind of the easiest way to think about these would be looking at hemorrhagic shock, right? So the patient's got to bleed. They're going to start off initially in compensated shock, right? So the bleed's been going on a couple minutes. The body's going to raise the heart rate, raise the blood pressure to compensate for that loss of blood. Once I've started to lose too much blood, right, there's only a certain amount that's available to pump through the body. The body can't produce it that quickly. So once we've lost too much, the pressure is just going to fall because there's not enough blood to push around anymore. And then once the patient has just completely lost too much blood, right, there's a point of no return where we're just not going to be able to save that patient's life, right? What they need is more blood, and we don't have that to give them. So at this point too, we're going to see multi-organ dysfunction. So multiple systems are going to go, right? So not only would we start to see impairment of the cardiovascular system, like the decreasing blood pressure, but we would also see like decreasing respirations at this point. The patient's going to kind of stop breathing. Maybe their mental status goes, right? They were conscious before, but now they've gone unconscious. Okay. Are there any questions on the stage of shock? So we will have a whole nother chapter too, just specifically about shock and resuscitation. So we're going to come back to this topic. So yeah, so when we get to irreversible shock, we're going to have multiple, it says up there, multi-organ dysfunction, right? So multiple of my organ systems are going to start failing at this point. So we talked about with the decompensated shock, what's starting to fail really is that cardiovascular system, right? Like our blood pressure's dropping. But once we hit irreversible shock, other organ systems are going to start to go too. So like maybe their breathing rate goes down or stops altogether, or maybe their mental status declines, right? Their neurological system. So whereas the patient might have been conscious initially, as we progress closer to that irreversible shock, they're going to go unconscious, right? Or maybe they become altered. So they're confused, not responding appropriately. Did that clarify it?
Yes, but one more thing. So for decompensated, they're still breathing in them.
Yes. Yep.
Okay.
Yep. So decompensated just means they're like, they've moved to that, from that, like when they're up and compensated, the body's homeostasis is still working properly. It's able to keep everything in check. But once they reach decompensated, like homeostasis is starting to fail at that point. So either that or the loss that they've suffered is just too great for the body to be able to compensate for. Good. Any other questions on anything that we have? Yes.
If you say the patient on is it going to recover? It's going to come back to
Yes, the patient could still recover if we recognize kind of that they're in this stage and intervene appropriately. So the appropriate interventions would all depend on what the cause of the shock is. So for example, let's take the hemorrhage example we were just talking about. Primary treatment from that is going to be to stop the bleeding. If we can stop the bleeding, we can probably save the patient's life. In the case of anaphylactic shock, if we deliver an appropriate medication in time, we're probably going to be able to save that patient as well. But like I said, once they're irreversible, they're probably not coming back from that, just because the loss has been too great. There's been too much injury to the cells and to the organs to where the patient's not going to recover.